Picture this: a milk truck rolling down your street before the sun is all the way up. A mother sending her 4-year-old to the corner store with a dollar bill and a handwritten note. A dentist handing out lollipops right after filling a cavity without any anesthesia. None of this was unusual. All of it was Tuesday. The 1950s ran on a set of habits so deeply ordinary that nobody alive at the time would have called them worth remembering. But every single one of them is gone now, and when you hear them described, they hit like a photograph you forgot you took. Number 100 starts with something that sat in every shoe store in the country, and if you saw one today, you would not believe it was ever pointed at a child. Further down, there is a moment that entire schools lined up for, and the relief on every parent's face in that gymnasium tells you everything about what the 1950s were really afraid of. So hit subscribe, because here are 100 forgotten memories of life in 1950s America. Number 100. The shoe-fitting fluoroscope at the shoe store. You stood on a wooden step, slid your feet into a slot at the base of a metal cabinet, and looked through a viewing port at the top. What you saw was a green X-ray image of the bones inside your shoes. Your toes glowed against the outline of the leather, and the salesman pointed at the screen and told your mother whether the fit was right. These machines showed up in shoe stores across the country in the late 1940s and stayed through most of the 1950s. Children loved them. The view of your own skeleton was more interesting than any shoe, and most kids asked to look again even after the purchase was made. Nobody in the store wore lead shielding. Nobody limited the exposures. A child trying on 3 pairs of shoes might stand on the fluoroscope 3 separate times in a single visit. By the late 1950s, medical researchers began publishing warnings about the radiation doses these machines delivered. States started banning them one by one. By the mid-1960s, they were gone from nearly every retail floor in the country. The generation that grew up staring at those green foot bones had no idea what was happening. Number 99. The morning newspaper landing on the front porch before dawn. Before the sun was up, a boy on a bicycle rode through the neighborhood tossing rolled papers onto porches, driveways, and doorsteps. The sound of it hitting the screen door or skidding across the concrete was part of the morning routine in every household that subscribed. And in the 1950s, that meant nearly all of them. Fathers picked it up on their way to the kitchen. The front page came first, then sports, then the classifieds. The paper sat at the breakfast table the way a phone sits at the table now, except nobody scrolled. You turned pages, folded sections in half to read the columns, and left the whole thing in a pile on the couch when you were done. Most cities had 2 papers, a morning and an evening edition. The evening paper arrived after work and covered the day's late-breaking news. By the time both editions faded in the following decades, the front porch lost one of its earliest sounds. The thud of newsprint before breakfast was as reliable as the sunrise, and just as easy to take for granted. Number 98. The bread box on the kitchen counter. Every kitchen had one. A metal or wooden box, usually chrome, or painted white with a hinged lid or a roll-top door that slid open on a curved track. Inside was the bread, sometimes a package of rolls, and whatever else needed to stay fresh without refrigeration. The bread box sat near the toaster, and opening it was one of the first things anyone did when making breakfast or packing a lunch. It kept the bread from drying out and protected it from anything crawling across the counter at night. Mothers had opinions about whether to keep the box closed tightly or leave it slightly open for air circulation, and these opinions were held with the certainty of religious conviction. When plastic bags with twist ties became the standard way to seal a loaf, and when kitchen counters started to shrink in newer homes, the bread box lost its purpose. Number 97. The doily on every surface in the living room. Under every lamp, beneath every vase, across the back of every armchair and the arms of every sofa, there was a doily. They were crocheted by hand, usually white or cream-colored, and they served no functional purpose that anyone could clearly explain. Grandmothers made them. Aunts gave them as gifts. They arrived at holidays in flat tissue-wrapped packages, and they went directly onto furniture. The round ones sat under table lamps. The rectangular ones lined dresser tops. The arm covers kept the fabric of the good chair from absorbing the oil from a man's hands while he watched the evening news. By the 1960s, decorating trends shifted toward cleaner surfaces, and the doily became a symbol of the old-fashioned parlor. They ended up in drawers, then boxes, then attics. But in the 1950s, a living room without doilies looked bare, and a grandmother without a crochet hook in her lap looked idle. Number 96. Saying grace before every single meal. Nobody picked up a fork until someone said the blessing. In most homes, it was the father. In some, it was the mother. In a few, it rotated, and children were expected to take their turn without fidgeting or giggling. The prayer was short, a few standard phrases that everyone at the table could recite from memory. Heads bowed, hands folded or held, eyes closed, except for the youngest child who peeked at the food. It lasted 10 seconds or less, but skipping it was not an option. Company dinners, holiday tables, and Tuesday night leftovers all started the same way. Even at restaurants, families bowed their heads before the meal arrived. The waitress knew to wait. Other diners did the same. It was so widespread that not saying grace was the thing that drew attention, not saying it. In the 1950s, dinner simply did not begin until someone spoke to the ceiling first. Number 95. The coin-operated horse outside the five and dime. It stood near the entrance, usually painted a chipped red or brown, bolted to a metal base with a slot for a dime. You climbed on, a parent dropped the coin in, and the horse rocked forward and back with a mechanical grind that sounded like it might shake apart any second. The ride lasted about 45 seconds. Children begged for another turn every single time. These horses stood outside Woolworths, Kriggy's, and grocery stores in towns across the country. Nobody supervised the ride. Nobody checked for a seatbelt, because there was none. The paint wore down to bare metal in the spots where thousands of small hands had held on, and the spring underneath groaned with every rock. When the stores closed or remodeled, the horses were hauled away and the bolts left 4 small holes in the concrete that nobody ever filled. Number 94. The vacuum cleaner salesman who dumped dirt on your carpet. He arrived unannounced, knocked on the front door with a heavy case in one hand, and asked the lady of the house for 10 minutes of her time. Before she could object, he was inside. And before she could sit down, he had poured a small pile of dirt directly onto the living room rug. That was the pitch. He dumped the dirt, then pulled out the vacuum, assembled it on the spot, and cleaned the mess so thoroughly that the carpet looked better than it had before he arrived. The demonstration lasted 20 minutes. The machine was always expensive, and the salesman always had a payment plan. Electrolux and Kirby salesmen worked entire neighborhoods door by door, and in some towns they were as familiar as the mailman. Women who refused the sale got their carpet cleaned for free. Women who said yes got the payments. Number 93. The DDT truck spraying the neighborhood on summer evenings. The truck came down the street trailing a thick white cloud, and every kid on the block ran straight into it. They rode their bikes through it. They chased it barefoot. Parents stood on the porch and watched, and nobody said a word, because DDT was the miracle chemical that killed mosquitoes, and mosquitoes carried polio, and polio was the thing every parent actually feared. Cities and towns across America sprayed DDT from trucks, from airplanes, and even over public beaches where families were sitting on their towels. It was in household bug spray. It was dusted on soldiers during the war to kill lice. The chemical was considered so safe that advertisements showed mothers spraying it directly on kitchen counters. It was not until the early 1960s that research began to link DDT to serious environmental damage, and the chemical was eventually banned for agricultural use in 1972. But through the 1950s, that white cloud rolling through the neighborhood was just summer. Number 92. The knife sharpener pushing his cart through the neighborhood. He came through every few weeks, pushing a wooden cart with a grinding wheel mounted on top. You heard him before you saw him, calling out in a rhythm that carried between the houses, or ringing a bell that every mother on the block recognized. Women came out carrying kitchen knives, scissors, and garden shears wrapped in a dish towel. He clamped the blade against the spinning wheel, sparks flew off the steel in a bright orange arc, and in 30 seconds a dull knife came back sharp enough to cut paper. He charged a dime or a quarter per blade, took his money, and moved on to the next block. In some neighborhoods, the same sharpener worked the same route for decades. He knew every household by name. When hardware stores started offering electric knife sharpeners for the home, the carts stopped coming. But the sound of that wheel against a kitchen blade belonged to a time when repair was cheaper than replacement. Number 91. Men wearing hats every time they left the house. In the 1950s, a man without a hat was a man who looked undressed. Fedoras, trilbies, and flat caps were not fashion statements. They were the last thing you grabbed on the way out the door, right after your wallet and your keys. Men wore hats to work, to church, to the grocery store, and to the ballpark. They tipped them to all women on the sidewalk. They removed them indoors, held them in their laps at restaurants, and hung them on the hat rack in the front hall the moment they came home. Every office building had a coat check. Every barber shop had a row of hooks by the door. The decline started when President Kennedy appeared at his inauguration without one. Whether or not that was the actual cause, the timing matched. By the mid-1960s, younger men stopped wearing them. By the 1970s, the hat rack was gone, and the men who still wore them were the ones who never stopped. Number 90. Blue laws that shut everything down on Sunday. On Sunday morning in the 1950s, the only places open in most towns were the church and the gas station. Everything else was closed by law. Grocery stores, department stores, hardware stores, barber shops, and movie theaters all locked their doors from Saturday night to Monday morning. The laws were old, some dating back to colonial times, and they varied by state and county. In some places you could buy medicine but not a magazine. In others you could pump gas but not buy a tire. The logic was rarely consistent, but the effect was. Sunday was quiet. Neighborhoods sounded different. Families had nowhere to go after church except home or to someone else's home. Children who grew up under blue laws remember Sundays as the longest day of the week. There was nothing to buy, nowhere to browse, and nothing to do but sit on the porch, visit relatives, or find your own entertainment in the yard. The laws loosened through the 1960s and 1970s, and Sunday eventually became just another shopping day. Number 89. The automat, where dinner came out of a little glass door. You walked in, dropped your nickel into a slot, turned a chrome knob, and lifted a small glass door to pull out a slice of pie, a bowl of macaroni and cheese, or a ham sandwich on white bread. The food sat behind individual compartments, each one lit from behind, rows and rows of them lining the walls like a vending machine the size of a room. Horn and Hardart ran the most famous automats in New York and Philadelphia, and they were packed from morning to midnight. Office workers, cab drivers, tourists, and penny-pinching families all ate shoulder to shoulder at marble counters. The coffee came from a dolphin head spigot and cost a nickel. The food was made fresh in kitchens behind the wall, and workers refilled the compartments through the back as fast as customers emptied them from the front. There was no waiter, no tip, and no waiting. It was the most democratic restaurant in America, and it vanished almost completely by the 1970s. Number 88. The ashtray in every room of the house. There was one on the coffee table, one on the kitchen counter, one on the nightstand, and one on the back of the toilet. Guests expected them. Hosts provided them. Nobody asked if it was all right to smoke indoors, because the answer was built into the furniture. Ashtrays came in every material and every size. Crystal ones sat in the living room. Ceramic ones shaped like leaves or fish decorated the den. Tin ones advertised hotels and gas stations. Heavy glass ones the size of a saucer anchored the end tables in every waiting room, barber shop, and doctor's office in the country. When a dinner party ended, the first thing the hostess did was empty the ashtrays, rinse them, and set them back out for the next day. The smell of cold ash hung in every house that kept them, which in the 1950s was nearly all of them. The generation that remembers these trays also remembers the yellow tint they left on white tablecloths and the permanent ring they left on wooden surfaces. Number 87. The Rug Beater and Spring Cleaning Day. It was a flat wire paddle with a long wooden handle, shaped like a tennis racket made of coiled steel. Twice a year, usually in spring and again before the holidays, every rug in the house went over the clothesline in the backyard. Then somebody beat it, hard. The dust that came out was staggering. Clouds of it billowed off the rug with every swing, gray and thick, and it told you exactly how much dirt had been ground into the fibers over the past 6 months. The whole neighborhood could hear it. That rhythmic thwack-thwack coming from 3 yards over meant somebody was cleaning house, and the sound carried across fences and down the alley. Children were sometimes handed the beater as a chore, and they swung at the rug until their arms ached. Vacuum cleaners existed, but they were expensive and underpowered, and nothing matched the visceral satisfaction of seeing a season's worth of dust leave a rug in one afternoon. Number 86. Drive-in restaurants with car hops on roller skates. You pulled your car into a parking slot, flashed your headlights, and within a minute a young woman on roller skates glided over to your window with an order pad in her hand. She clipped a metal tray to the edge of your car door, and you ate your cheeseburger and milkshake without ever leaving the front seat. The drive-in restaurant was one of the defining inventions of post-war America. Sonic, A&W, and hundreds of independent stands stretched along highways and suburban strips from coast to coast. The menus were simple: burgers, fries, onion rings, malts, floats, and hot dogs. The prices were low. A full meal for 2 cost less than $1 at most places. Teenagers made them their headquarters. On Friday and Saturday nights, the lots filled with cars, and the car hops wove between bumpers and open windows, delivering trays piled with food and bottles of root beer. The jukebox at the counter pumped music across the lot. Some kids circled the parking lot in a slow loop just to see and be seen, which gave birth to the word cruising. The cars were long and chromed and wide enough to share a bench seat. The food was handed through the window on trays that hooked over the glass. The car hops moved through the lot with a balance that looked effortless, skating between Chevrolets and Fords with loaded trays held high. When fast food chains built indoor counters and drive-through lanes in the 1960s and 1970s, the car hop model faded. A few survived, but the version that most people remember, the one with the skating waitresses and the trays on the car doors and the sound of rock and roll drifting across a parking lot on a summer night, was a creature of the 1950s, and nothing that replaced it ever felt the same. Number 85. The cursive handwriting chart above the chalkboard. A long strip of cardboard or heavy paper ran across the top of the wall in every elementary school classroom, showing every letter of the alphabet in perfect cursive, uppercase and lowercase. Capital Q looked like the number 2, capital Z looked like a backwards 3, and every child stared at those letters while trying to reproduce them on lined paper with a pencil that was either too sharp or too dull. Penmanship drills happened daily. You formed each letter over and over in slow, careful strokes, connecting them in a flowing line that the chart made look effortless but your hand made look like a minor emergency. Teachers walked the rows, corrected your grip, and told you to slant your paper. Left-handed children were sometimes forced to write with the right hand, which helped nobody. By the time the same children reached high school, most of them had abandoned cursive entirely in favor of print, but the chart stayed on the wall. It outlasted multiple generations of students, and if you close your eyes and picture your second-grade classroom, that chart is probably the first thing you see. Number 84. The bookmobile that parked on your street every 2 weeks. It was a converted bus or a large van with shelves built into every wall, carrying a few hundred books right to the curb. The librarian inside knew most of the children by name, You climbed the steps, browsed the narrow aisle, and checked out 2 or 3 titles on a small card she stamped with the due date. In neighborhoods far from a library, the bookmobile was the only way most children encountered books outside of school. It smelled like old paper and engine exhaust. The schedule was posted at the post office and the drugstore, and kids waited on the sidewalk at the appointed time. When it pulled away, you stood there holding your stack, knowing you had exactly 14 days before it came back. Number 83. Taking cod liver oil every morning before school. The bottle sat on the kitchen counter, and every child in the house got a spoonful before breakfast. It was thick, fishy, and so unpleasant that some children gagged on contact. Mothers held the spoon out like a verdict. You swallowed it, winced, and chased it with orange juice if you were lucky. The oil was rich in vitamins A and D, and in the 1950s it was considered essential for growing bones and preventing rickets. Pediatricians recommended it. Grandmothers insisted on it. The smell alone could turn a child's stomach from across the room. Some families switched to the flavored kind, which tasted like fish oil mixed with artificial cherry, a combination that improved nothing. Others switched to cod liver oil capsules, which were large, slippery, and hard to swallow. By the 1960s, chewable multivitamins in the shape of cartoon characters replaced the spoon entirely, and children everywhere were quietly relieved. Number 82. The cloakroom at the back of every classroom. It was a narrow room or a deep closet behind the last row of desks, lined with hooks at child height and a shelf above for lunchboxes. Every morning you walked in, hung your coat on your assigned hook, put your boots underneath if it was winter, and went to your seat. The cloakroom smelled like wet wool and rubber galoshes from October through March. It was also the place where teachers sent children who misbehaved. Sitting in the cloakroom while the rest of the class continued without you was a specific kind of humiliation that combined boredom with the faint smell of somebody else's lunch. When open-plan classrooms and built-in cubbies replaced the cloakroom in newer schools, it disappeared without ceremony. But every child who hung a coat on one of those hooks remembers the sound of 30 metal hangers clicking against the wall and a winter coat that never fully dried before 3 o'clock. Number 81. The inkwell built into every school desk. Each wooden desk had a small round hole in the upper right corner, and in that hole sat a glass or ceramic inkwell. You dipped your pen, wrote a line or two, and dipped again. Penmanship was graded seriously, and a blot on your paper was enough to get it sent back. Left-handed children had it worst. They dragged their hand through wet ink with every word, and some teachers forced them to switch hands entirely. The ink was blue-black, it stained fingers for days, and it smelled faintly of iron. Filling the inkwells was a classroom chore, assigned to one student who carried a small bottle of ink from desk to desk with a steady hand and a rag tucked in his belt. Ballpoint pens existed by the late 1940s, but many schools considered them a shortcut that encouraged sloppy writing. The inkwell stayed in the desk well into the 1950s in some districts, and the round hole remained in the wood long after the ink was gone. Number 80. Testing your own vacuum tubes at the drugstore. When the television picture went dark or the radio started humming, the first step was pulling the back panel off the set and checking the tubes. You carried the suspects to the drugstore or the hardware store, where a large metal testing machine sat against the wall near the register. Each tube plugged into a labeled socket. You pressed the button and the needle on the dial told you whether the tube was good or dead. If it was dead, the store sold a replacement right there on the shelf. Television repairmen made house calls for bigger problems, but most families tested their own tubes first. The machine was completely self-service. Kids learned which tubes went where by watching their fathers do it on a Saturday morning. Number 79. Running errands to the neighborhood shop by yourself. Your mother handed you a few dollar bills and a short list, and sent you walking to the store by yourself. You were 7, maybe 8. The store was a few blocks away, and you went on foot. You bought bread, milk, a can of soup, or whatever the list said, paid the cashier, carried the bag home, and counted out the change on the kitchen table. Nobody found it strange that a young child was shopping alone. The cashier recognized your family. The walk was considered perfectly safe. In many cases, the list included cigarettes, and the cashier sold them without hesitation because it was understood you were picking them up for a parent. Today, the combination of age verification laws, heightened concern about unaccompanied minors, and the general disappearance of walkable neighborhood stores has made this kind of errand a relic. Number 78. Putting tinsel on the Christmas tree one strand at a time. The tinsel came in flat rectangular boxes, each strand a thin strip of silver foil about 18 inches long. The correct method, according to every mother in the country, was to drape each strand individually over a branch so it hung perfectly straight and caught the light. Children threw handfuls at the tree instead, which produced immediate correction. The strand-by-strand process took longer than decorating the rest of the tree combined. When it was finished, the tree shimmered under the lights and turned the corner of the living room into something that belonged in a department store window. Removing the tinsel after Christmas was worse than putting it on, and most families gave up and threw the tree out with half the strands still clinging to the branches. Number 77. The welcome wagon lady who visited every new family on the block. Within days of moving into a new house, a woman knocked on the front door carrying a basket filled with small gifts, coupons, and pamphlets from local businesses. She introduced herself, welcomed you to the neighborhood, and told you where to find the nearest grocery store, doctor's office, church, and school. The Welcome Wagon was a nationwide program that operated in thousands of towns. The women who ran it were local volunteers or part-time employees who knew their neighborhoods thoroughly. The basket usually included a free loaf of bread from the local bakery, a discount coupon for the hardware store, and a list of phone numbers for everything from the fire department to the nearest plumber. For families arriving in a new town with no connections and no internet to search, the Welcome Wagon Lady was the first friendly face and the first useful information they received. She came, she smiled, she left her basket, and she moved on to the next new family down the street. Number 76. Saving string, tin foil, and rubber bands in a kitchen drawer. Every house had one. A drawer, usually near the back door or next to the refrigerator, where nothing got thrown away if it might be useful again. Pieces of string went in. Rubber bands from the newspaper went in. Tin foil, rinsed and folded flat, went in. So did twist ties, bread clips, broken pencils, half-used rolls of tape, and keys that no longer opened anything. The habit came from the war, when rationing made everything precious. By the 1950s, rationing was over, but the instinct stayed. Mothers who grew up during the Depression saved everything, and they taught their children to do the same. Throwing away a piece of string that still had length in it felt wasteful, even if it never got used again. The drawer grew heavier every year. Nobody cleaned it out. Nobody organized it. And when you needed a rubber band or a piece of string, you opened that drawer and spent 5 minutes digging through a tangle of small objects that amounted to a single philosophy. Nothing is garbage until you are sure. Number 75. The ironing board that was always set up somewhere in the house. In the 1950s, the ironing board was not stored away. It lived in the kitchen, the spare bedroom, or the hallway, permanently open because it was used every single day. Shirts, trousers, blouses, tablecloths, pillowcases, and handkerchiefs all went across the board. The iron was heavy, made of solid metal, and heated on the stove or plugged into the wall. Steam irons existed by the end of the decade, but many households still used the older kind, tested against a wet finger for temperature. A hiss meant ready. A burn meant too hot. Mothers ironed for an hour at a time, sometimes longer, working through a basket of sprinkled laundry that had been rolled up damp the night before. Nobody left the house in a wrinkled shirt. Not for work, not for school, not for church, not for the grocery store. The ironing board was as permanent as the kitchen table, and the woman who stood at it every morning was doing a job that modern fabrics eventually eliminated. Number 74. The formal dining room that nobody used except Thanksgiving and Christmas. The table wore a lace cloth or a linen runner. The chairs had cushions that matched the curtains. A china cabinet stood against the wall holding plates and crystal that never saw a weeknight meal. The room stayed spotless because nobody was allowed to play in it. The family ate every ordinary dinner in the kitchen. Twice a year, the good china came down from the cabinet, the table was extended with its hidden leaf, and the dining room became the center of the house for a few hours. Then the dishes were washed by hand. The cloth was folded, the leaf went back under the table, and the room returned to being empty and perfect until the next holiday arrived. Number 73. The sewing basket that every mother kept beside her chair. It sat next to the armchair or the sofa. A lidded basket or a tin box filled with needles, thread in a dozen colors, buttons saved from worn-out shirts, a pincushion shaped like a tomato, and a small pair of scissors with pointed tips. Mending happened every evening. A torn pocket, a missing button, a hem that came loose at school. The mother sat down after dinner, opened the basket, and fixed whatever needed fixing before it could be worn again. Buying a new shirt because a button fell off was not a thought that crossed anyone's mind. Children learned to sew from watching, and by 10 most girls could repair a straight seam. The basket traveled. It came out at holidays when a dress needed adjusting. It came out at the neighbor's house when someone's curtain tore. It was a permanent fixture of domestic life, and it sat in the same spot in the same room for years. When ready-made clothes became cheap enough to replace instead of repair, the basket finally closed. Number 72. Paint by numbers on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The kits came in flat cardboard boxes with a picture on the front showing what the finished painting was supposed to look like. Inside was a pre-printed board divided into dozens of irregular shapes, each marked with a tiny number, and a row of small paint pots with matching numbers on their lids. You sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water for rinsing the brush, a paper towel for blotting, and worked your way across the board, filling in each numbered space with the corresponding color. The brushes were cheap and lost their shape quickly. The paint was thick and dried fast, which meant you had to keep the lids on tight or the pots hardened into useless lumps within a week. The Craft Master Company sold millions of these kits in the early 1950s, and by 1954 more Americans were buying paint-by-number sets than buying original artwork. Landscapes, horses, ocean sunsets, and portraits of clowns were the most popular subjects. The finished paintings hung in living rooms and hallways across the country, and guests either admired them or quietly recognized the telltale numbered section edges where colors met. The kits cost $1 or $2 at the 5 and dime, and they gave ordinary people who had never held a real brush the satisfaction of completing something that looked, from a distance, like a painting. That was the whole appeal. You did not need talent, you just needed patience and a steady hand. Number 71. The ice cream social at the church on summer evenings. On a warm night in June or July, the church lawn filled with folding tables, paper lanterns, and families from every block in the neighborhood. Somebody cranked a hand-turned ice cream maker in the shade. Others brought cakes and pies. Children ran across the grass while adults sat in metal chairs and talked until the mosquitoes drove everyone inside. The ice cream was homemade, usually vanilla or strawberry, packed in a wooden barrel with rock salt and ice around the metal canister. Taking a turn at the crank was a privilege for older children. The ice cream came out soft and slightly grainy, nothing like what came from the store, and it melted fast in the heat. Nobody paid admission. A donation jar sat near the lemonade. The whole event ran on volunteer labor and leftover supplies. It was the kind of gathering that needed no entertainment and no agenda. People came because the ice cream was good and the evening was long, and because being with the people on your street was reason enough. Number 70. The vegetable man who sold produce from the back of his truck. He came through the neighborhood once or twice a week, usually in a flatbed or a converted panel truck with wooden crates of fruits and vegetables stacked in the back. He parked at the corner and rang a bell, or he drove slowly down the block calling out what he had. Mothers walked out to the truck with their coin purses and picked through the tomatoes and peaches by hand. The produce was local and seasonal. In summer, it was sweet corn, watermelons, green beans, and berries. In fall, it was squash and apples. Nothing came from far away. Nothing was out of season. The vegetable man knew his customers. He saved the good ears of corn for the woman who always bought a dozen. He let children take a grape from the bunch when nobody was looking. Supermarkets with year-round produce sections eventually made him unnecessary. But the families who bought from the truck remembered the difference between a tomato that arrived in a crate that morning and one that sat under fluorescent light for a week. Number 69. Home canning season in late summer. When the tomatoes ripened, the kitchen turned into a factory. Pots of boiling water covered the stove. Mason jars lined the counter in rows. Lids, rings, and rubber seals sat in a dish towel next to the sink. The air smelled like hot vinegar and cooked fruit. Mothers and grandmothers canned everything: tomatoes, green beans, peaches, pickles, jams, jellies, and apple butter. The work lasted days. You peeled, chopped, blanched, packed, and sealed, then lowered the filled jars into a canning pot with a wire rack and boiled them long enough to kill anything inside. The finished jars went to the basement or the pantry, lined up on shelves like a personal grocery store. A family that canned well could eat from those shelves all winter. The jars clicked as they cooled, and the sound of a lid popping down to seal was the signal that the batch had worked. An unsealed lid meant a wasted jar and a disappointed cook. Nobody took the work lightly. Number 68. White gloves for women on any formal outing. A woman did not leave the house for church, a luncheon, a department store, or a funeral without pulling on a pair of white cotton or nylon gloves that reached past the wrist. They matched the hat. They matched the handbag. They completed the outfit the way a period completes a sentence. Gloves were sold at every department store, folded flat in slim boxes at the accessories counter. Women owned multiple pairs, short ones for daytime, longer ones for evening. Some were plain cotton. Others had tiny pearl buttons at the wrist. Putting them on was the last step before walking out the front door, and taking them off was one of the first things you did when you sat down. Etiquette books devoted entire chapters to when to wear gloves and when to remove them. You never shook hands with gloves on. You never ate with them on. By the mid-1960s, the gloves came off, and within a decade, the idea sounded like something from another century. Number 67. The family Bible on the hallway table. It was large, leather-bound, and heavy enough that no child could lift it with one hand. It sat on a table in the hall or on a shelf in the living room, and inside the front cover was a series of handwritten entries recording every birth, marriage, and death in the family going back decades. The penmanship varied. Some entries were careful and formal, written in ink with full middle names and exact dates. Others were penciled in, quickly, as if the news had arrived in a rush. Pressed flowers, prayer cards from funerals, and old photographs were sometimes tucked between the pages. Nobody read it daily. It was not for devotion so much as for record-keeping. When someone wanted to settle a question about a birthday, an anniversary, or the year a great-aunt passed away, they opened the family Bible. It carried more confirmed history between its covers than any filing cabinet in the house. Number 66. Department store. Elevator operators announcing each floor. You stepped into the elevator at street level, and a uniformed operator pulled the gate shut, pressed the lever, and called out the departments as the car rose. Second floor, ladies' wear and millinery. Third floor, housewares and appliances. Fourth floor, furniture and bedding. The operators stood all day, pulling the lever to align the car with each floor. They wore white gloves and spoke in a clear, even tone. Most of them were women. The good ones timed the stop perfectly so the elevator floor met the building floor without a bump. Children loved riding the elevator. The brass gate, the mechanical hum, the polished interior, and the operator's voice made each trip feel like a small event. Automatic elevators replaced them in the 1960s and 1970s. The buttons did the job, but they never told you what was on the third floor, and they never smiled when you stepped in. Number 65. The corner candy store where everything cost a penny. A glass case at the front of the counter held rows of small bins, each one filled with a different candy. Mary Jane's, Fireballs, Wax Lips, Root Beer Barrels, Tootsie Rolls, Atomic Fireballs, Bazooka Bubblegum with a comic strip folded inside the wrapper. You walked in with a nickel and left with a small paper bag holding 5 separate choices. The decision was agonizing. The man behind the counter waited with a pair of tongs while you pointed, changed your mind, pointed again, and finally committed. Every child on the block had a strategy. Some went for volume, others went for flavor. A few bought the same thing every single time. The candy store was usually part of something else, a newsstand, a cigar shop, a corner grocery. It smelled like sugar and old wood and the inside of a cash register. When penny candy stopped costing a penny, the format died, but the memory of standing in front of that glass case with a warm coin in your hand is one that nobody who experienced it has ever fully let go. Number 64. The doctor making house calls with a black leather bag. When a child had a fever, a cough that would not quit, or an earache that kept them up all night, the mother called the doctor's office and he came to the house. He drove over in his own car, walked through the front door, and sat on the edge of the bed with his leather bag open beside him. Inside the bag was a stethoscope, a thermometer, a blood pressure cuff, a reflex hammer, tongue depressors, and a few small bottles of medicine. He listened to your chest, looked down your throat, pressed on your stomach, and told your mother what was wrong. Sometimes he left a prescription. Sometimes he just said to keep the child in bed and push fluids. The bill came in the mail. It was not cheap, but it was reasonable, and some doctors ran a tab for families who could not pay all at once. By the 1960s, medical practice began consolidating into clinics and group offices, and the house call became an exception rather than the rule. Number 63. The slipcover on the living room furniture. The sofa cost a month's wages, and nobody was going to let it get stained, worn, or faded. So a fitted slipcover went over the entire piece, stretched tight and tucked under the cushions, and the original upholstery lived underneath like a secret. Some families kept the slipcovers on year-round. Others took them off for holidays and company, revealing the unblemished fabric beneath like a second living room hidden inside the first. Children were told not to eat on the sofa regardless. The slipcovers were washed, ironed, and put back on. The plastic furniture cover was the extreme version. It crackled when you sat on it, stuck to bare legs in summer, and made every seat feel like sitting on a raincoat. Certain households kept the plastic on for years, preserving a sofa so thoroughly that the day it was finally uncovered, the fabric underneath looked brand new. The furniture survived. The comfort did not. Number 62. The drugstore lunch counter where you could get a grilled cheese and a cherry Coke. Every neighborhood drugstore had one. A long Formica counter with chrome stools that spun. A soda fountain behind the counter with syrup handles and a carbonation tap, and a short-order grill where somebody made sandwiches, soup, and the best milkshakes in the neighborhood. You sat at the counter, ordered from the man in the white paper hat, and ate your lunch 2 feet from the prescription counter where the pharmacist was filling bottles. The stools swiveled 360 degrees, and every child who ever sat on one tested that fact immediately. The lunch counter was where teenagers went after school, where old men drank coffee in the morning, and where families stopped for a sundae on Saturday afternoon. It was casual, cheap, and utterly ordinary. When chain pharmacies moved into strip malls and dropped the food counter, the drugstore became a place you drove to, picked up a bag, and left. The stools stopped spinning. Number 61. The milkman leaving glass bottles on the front porch before breakfast. He arrived before dawn in a white truck with wire racks of glass bottles rattling in the back. He carried them 2 at a time to the front step, picked up the empties, and was gone before anyone in the house was fully awake. The bottles were heavy, clear, glass with a wide mouth and a cardboard cap pressed into the top. The cream rose to the top overnight and formed a thick yellow layer that you shook back in or poured off, depending on how your family took their coffee. In winter, the milk froze on the porch and the cream pushed the cap up like a mushroom. Every family had a standing order: 2 quarts on Monday, 3 on Thursday. Some added eggs or butter to the delivery. The milkman kept a ledger and collected payment every 2 weeks. He knew the families, he knew the dogs. Supermarkets selling milk in cartons for less eventually ended the route. Number 60. Launching yourself off the high board at the public pool. Nothing separated the brave kids from the rest faster than that 3-meter board at the municipal pool. It stood 10 feet above the water, sometimes 12, and the board bounced under your weight as you walked to the end and looked down. The water below seemed impossibly far away. You jumped or you climbed back, down in shame, and every kid at the pool was watching. Some pools had a low board and a high board, and graduating from one to the other was a genuine rite of passage. Belly flops stung for an hour, back flops left welts. Occasionally, someone hit the water at a bad angle and had to be pulled out by the lifeguard. The high dive started vanishing from public pools in the 1980s and 1990s, pulled out because of insurance costs, injury liability, and new safety regulations. Today, very few public pools still have one, and an entire generation of children will never know what it felt like to stand on that board and decide. Number 59. The clothes sprinkler bottle for dampening shirts before ironing. It was a glass soda bottle, usually a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi, fitted with a metal or cork stopper that had small holes punched in the top. You filled it with water, shook it over the wrinkled shirt, and let the droplets soak into the cotton. The shirt then went back into a rolled bundle and sat in a basket until you were ready to iron it. The dampness let the hot iron press the creases out cleanly. Without it, the wrinkles set deeper, and the iron left a scorched shine on dry fabric. Every ironing basket had a sprinkler bottle in it. Some were store-bought with a proper sprinkler cap. Most were repurposed soda bottles because the shape fit the hand, and the glass held up to daily use. When steam irons made the sprinkler unnecessary, the bottle went into the kitchen drawer or the trash. But the women who used one every morning for a decade remember the weight of it in their hand and the soft hiss of water hitting warm cotton. Number 58. The civil defense siren test every Saturday at noon. At exactly 12 o'clock, the air raid siren on top of the fire station or the water tower wound up to full volume and held its wail for a solid minute. Everyone in town heard it. Nobody flinched, because it happened every single week and it was always just a test. But the sound itself was designed to be impossible to ignore. A rising and falling tone that carried for miles across open ground. Children playing outside paused for a moment and then went right back to what they were doing. The siren was part of the Cold War landscape, a weekly reminder that the country stood ready for an attack that most people believed could come at any time. When the weekly tests eventually stopped in later decades, the silence on Saturday at noon felt strange for years. Number 57. The coal delivery truck and the chute on the side of the house. In older neighborhoods, many homes still burned coal for heat into the 1950s. A small metal door on the exterior wall of the basement opened into a chute, and when the coal truck arrived, the driver backed up to the house, opened the chute door, and sent a load of black anthracite clattering down into the bin below. The noise was enormous. A river of coal pouring down a metal chute into a concrete basement echoed through the whole block. Children stood at a safe distance and watched. The coal dust settled on everything within 20 feet. The furnace had to be fed by hand. Someone, usually the father, went down to the basement every morning and evening with a shovel, loaded the firebox, adjusted the damper, and carried the ash bucket out to the curb. The work was dirty, constant, and cold. When oil and gas furnaces replaced coal in the late 1950s and 1960s, the chute doors were sealed shut and the coal bins were converted into storage rooms. Number 56. Window fans in every bedroom before central air. Before air conditioning reached most homes, the only mechanical relief from a summer night was the box fan wedged into the window frame. It sat on the sill, humming at a steady pitch, pulling warm air out of the room and drawing whatever cooler air existed outside back in through the other windows. The fan ran all night. Its motor was loud enough to mask the sound of crickets, passing cars, and the neighbor's radio, which made it a sleep aid as much as a cooling device. Children fell asleep to its drone and woke up when the motor clicked off at dawn because someone downstairs turned it off to save electricity. Every family positioned the fans according to their own theory of airflow. One facing in on this side, one facing out on that side. The hallway door cracked 2 inches. The theories were defended with total conviction and almost never tested. When central air arrived in the 1960s and 1970s, the fan went to the attic. Number 55. The Sunday drive after church with no destination at all. After church let out and the blue law stillness settled over town, the family climbed into the car and drove. Nobody decided where. The father drove. The mother looked out the window. The children sat in the back and watched the scenery or fought over armrest territory. The route went through neighborhoods they did not live in, past farms, along the river, or out toward the edge of town where new houses were going up. Sometimes they stopped for ice cream. Sometimes they pulled over to look at something. Most of the time they just drove. Gas was cheap. The roads were empty on Sunday. The car was the only air-conditioned room in the house for many families, which made driving more comfortable than sitting at home. The drive lasted an hour, sometimes 2, and ended back in the driveway with nothing accomplished and nothing planned. It was recreation in its simplest form, and it required nothing but a tank of gas and nowhere to be. Number 54. The wire grocery cart you pulled to the store on foot. In cities and small towns where the market was close enough to walk, families owned a folding wire cart on 2 wheels with a hinged handle. You pulled it behind you on the sidewalk, filled it at the store, and wheeled it home again. The wheels rattled over every crack in the pavement. Mothers and grandmothers used them every few days because many households had only one car and the father drove it to work each morning. The cart folded flat and leaned against the wall in the kitchen or on the back porch when it was not in use. It was not a luxury item. It was how groceries moved from the store to the house when walking was the only option, and nobody considered it unusual. Number 53. The wringer washer in the basement that could catch your arm. Before automatic washers, laundry went through a machine with a round tub and a set of rubber rollers mounted on top. You fed the wet clothes between the rollers by hand, turned a crank or pressed a lever, and the rollers squeezed the water out flat. The danger was real. If a finger or a sleeve caught in the rollers, the machine pulled your hand in after it. Children were warned never to stand near the wringer while it was running. Mothers who used one every week knew exactly how fast to feed the fabric through and when to release the safety bar. The wash water was heated on the stove and carried to the machine in buckets. White clothes went first, while the water was clean. Colors went second. Work clothes went last. The same water served the entire load. Automatic top-loading washers replaced the wringer through the 1950s, but families that could not afford the upgrade used the old machine well into the 1960s. Number 52. Metal roller skates with a key that hung around your neck. These were not shoe skates. They were steel platforms with 4 wheels that clamped onto the soles of your regular shoes. You tightened them with a small metal key that fit into a square nut at the toe clamp, and every child who owned a pair wore that key on a string around their neck so it would not get lost. The skates rattled on the sidewalk like a handful of bolts dropped on concrete. They loosened with every block, and retightening them mid-skate was a routine interruption that happened every 10 minutes. The wheels were hard steel with no bearings, and they vibrated through your entire skeleton. Every crack in the sidewalk was a potential disaster. A pebble in the wrong place could lock a wheel and send you sprawling. But you skated anyway, because the skates cost $2 and the sidewalk was free. When shoe skates with rubber wheels arrived, the clamp-on kind disappeared, and the skate key became a relic that turned up in junk drawers for years, attached to a string nobody remembered wearing. Number 51. Twin beds on every television show, even for married couples. Married characters in 1950s television slept in separate single beds with a nightstand in between. Lucy and Ricky Ricardo did it. Ozzie and Harriet did it. Ward and June Cleaver did it. The network standards of the decade would not permit a husband and wife to share a double bed on screen, because the suggestion of physical closeness was considered too much for a family audience. Real married couples across the country slept in the same bed without a second thought. But on television, the arrangement was presented as perfectly normal. Children who watched these programs assumed that was just how grown-ups slept. The rule held through most of the decade and into the next before it quietly disappeared. Number 50. The aluminum ice cube tray with the pull handle. Before flexible plastic trays, ice cube trays were stamped from aluminum with a metal lever running across the top. You filled the tray at the sink, carried it carefully to the freezer, and when the cubes were frozen, you pulled the handle straight up to crack them free. The mechanism worked by twisting a divider grid that broke the cubes away from the tray walls. It required real force. The handle was cold enough to stick to wet fingers. The cubes came out in uneven shapes, and at least 2 or 3 always stayed frozen to the bottom no matter how hard you pulled. Carrying a full tray to the freezer without spilling was a household skill that every family member attempted and most failed at on a regular basis. Number 49. The plastic furniture cover that crackled when you sat down. Some families took furniture protection to its logical extreme by draping the sofa and armchairs in clear vinyl covers that sealed the upholstery like shrink wrap on a leftover. You sat on it and it crackled. You shifted your weight and it stuck to your skin. In summer, bare legs peeled off the plastic with a sound that carried across the room. The covers stayed on for years. Visitors sat on them without comment, because commenting would have been rude, and because every third house on the block had the same arrangement. The sofa beneath was pristine. The sofa on top was a sensory punishment. The rationale was simple. Furniture was expensive. Children were destructive. The plastic cover was the compromise between having a nice living room and living in it. When the family finally sold the house or replaced the couch 20 years later, the original fabric underneath looked exactly as it had on the day it arrived from the showroom. Mission accomplished, at the cost of every comfortable moment that might have happened on it. Number 48. The Burma shave signs along the highway. They came in sets of 5 or 6, small red signs planted in the ground along the roadside about 100 feet apart. Each sign held a single line of a rhyming jingle, and you read them in sequence as you drove past. The first sign might say, "Does your husband?" The second, "Misbehave." The third, "Grunt and grumble." The fourth, "Rant and rave." The fifth, "Shoot the brute some." And the sixth, "Burma shave." The campaign started in the late 1920s and ran through the 1950s, planted on rural highways and state roads across the entire country. The Burma Shave Company sold brushless shaving cream, but the signs were famous for their humor, not their product. Road trips were built around spotting the next set. Children in the back seat read them aloud, one sign at a time, building the joke with each post that passed the window. Some jingles were about shaving, some were about safe driving, some were just strange. They worked because the highway was boring and the signs were funny, and because there was nothing else to read between towns except billboards and barn advertisements. The company pulled the last signs down in 1963 after selling the brand. The wooden posts were small, easy to miss at speed, and never preserved. But the families who drove past them on 2-lane highways in the 1950s remember the rhythm of reading one line at a time, waiting for the punchline, and hearing the whole car laugh when the last sign appeared. Number 47. The backyard vegetable garden that fed the family half the summer. Almost every house with a yard had one. A plot of dirt behind the garage or along the back fence, turned over every spring with a spade, planted in rows marked with seed packets stuck on sticks, and tended by hand every evening after supper. Tomatoes, cucumbers, green beans, lettuce, radishes, squash, and peppers filled the rows. The garden started producing in June and kept going through September. Dinners came from the yard. Salads came from the yard. The overflow went to neighbors or into canning jars for winter. Children were assigned weeding duty as a chore, which nobody enjoyed but everyone did. The soil got under your fingernails and stayed there. The tomatoes were warm from the sun and tasted like nothing sold in a store, and eating one straight off the vine with salt was a minor event of summer. When suburbia spread into smaller lots with more lawn and less dirt, the family garden shrank and eventually disappeared. Number 46. The hot water bottle for aches, cramps, and cold winter nights. It was a flat rubber bladder with a wide screw cap, filled at the sink with the hottest water the tap could produce. You screwed the cap tight, wrapped the bottle in a towel, and pressed it against whatever hurt. For stomach cramps, it went on your belly. For sore muscles, it went behind your back. For cold feet on a winter night, it went under the covers at the foot of the bed and stayed warm for hours. The rubber smelled faintly medical, and the water sloshed when you shifted. Every medicine cabinet had one. They cost next to nothing, lasted for years, and required no electricity. When heating pads with electric coils arrived, the hot water bottle was considered old-fashioned. But the people who used one remember the specific comfort of that soft, warm weight pressed against a sore back on a cold night, and nothing electric ever reproduced it exactly. Number 45. The rag man who collected old clothes and scrap from the alley. He came through on a horse-drawn cart or a battered flatbed truck, calling out in a half-sung chant that carried between the buildings. He bought rags, old clothes, scrap metal, newspapers, and anything else a household wanted to get rid of. Mothers brought out bags of worn-out shirts and torn sheets. The ragman weighed them, offered a few cents a pound, and loaded the pile onto his cart. The rags went to factories that processed them into industrial wiping cloths, paper stock, or stuffing. In cities, the ragman was a fixture. His route was as regular as the mailman's, and his chant was recognizable from 2 blocks away. Children followed his cart for the novelty of the horse and the smell of the pile. When curbside garbage pickup became universal and second-hand stores replaced the door-to-door trade, the ragman stopped coming. His cart, his chant, and the entire economy of household salvage he represented vanished from American streets within a single generation. Number 44. The afternoon movie matinee for a dime. On Saturday afternoon, children lined up at the neighborhood theater with enough change for a ticket and a box of popcorn. The matinee started at 1 o'clock and usually included a cartoon, a newsreel, a serial episode, and the main feature. You sat in the dark for 3 hours. The seats folded up with a snap when you stood. The floor was sticky. The candy counter sold Milk Duds, jujubes, and raisinets in boxes so small they were empty before the first reel ended. The serial was the hook. Each episode ended on a cliffhanger, and you had to come back next Saturday to see what happened. Parents sent their children alone. The theater was supervised by an usher with a flashlight who kept order and moved anyone who was too loud. The whole afternoon cost less than a quarter, and for a generation of children, it was the single best thing about Saturday. Number 43. The party line where you could hear the neighbors talking. In the 1950s, many households did not have a private telephone line. They shared one with 2 or 3 other families on the same circuit. Each household had its own ring pattern. 2 shorts and a long meant the Millers. 3 shorts meant the family down the road. You picked up only for your ring. But picking up during someone else's call was always possible, and everyone knew it. You lifted the receiver carefully, covered the mouthpiece, and listened. The neighbors did the same. Gossip traveled faster on the party line than it did at the church social because you could hear it firsthand. Long conversations tied up the line for everyone. Urgent calls required asking the other party to hang up, which sometimes worked and sometimes started a feud. Private lines became available through the 1960s, and by the 1970s the party line was gone. Number 42. The console television set that was a piece of furniture. The television did not sit on a stand. It lived inside a wooden cabinet the size of a small dresser, with legs, a polished finish, and sometimes a built-in record player or radio behind a hinged door on the side. The screen was small, usually 17 or 21 inches, set into the front of a cabinet that could stretch 4 feet wide. The rest of the space held the electronics, tubes, wires, transformers, and a speaker hidden behind a fabric panel. It took up the most prominent position in the living room and was treated like a piece of furniture because it was one. Moving it required 2 men and a plan. Dusting it was a weekly chore. The top of the set became a display shelf for family photographs, ceramic figurines, and a vase of artificial flowers. When portable sets arrived and screens got larger while cabinets got smaller, the console went to the basement or the dump. Nobody saved them, and the ones that survived are now curiosities. Number 41. The waiting pool on the front lawn on a hot afternoon. It was a round metal tub, or an inflatable ring, never more than a foot deep, placed on the grass wherever the hose could reach. Toddlers sat in the water. Older children stood in it and splashed. The water came from the garden hose and hit cold enough to make you gasp when you first stepped in. By mid-afternoon, the sun had warmed it to bath temperature, and by evening it was cloudy with grass clippings and dead bugs. Nobody drained it daily. The water sat until someone remembered to dump it, or a rainstorm did the job. Every other yard on the block had one in July and August, and the sound of children shrieking at the cold water was as steady as the cicadas. Number 40. The polio vaccine line at school. Before the vaccine arrived, polio was the disease every parent in America feared above all others. Swimming pools shut down during outbreaks, movie theaters emptied. Children were kept indoors through entire summers in neighborhoods where a single case had been reported, and the word itself carried a weight that no other illness could match. Families watched newsreels of children in iron lungs and said nothing at the dinner table afterward. When the Salk vaccine was declared safe and effective, in 1955, schools became vaccination stations almost overnight. Children lined up in gymnasiums and cafeterias, rolled up their sleeves, and received the injection from nurses who moved through the lines with steady hands. Some children cried. Most just watched the kid in front of them and copied whatever expression that child wore walking away. Parents showed up to volunteer. They organized the lines, handed out lollipops at the end, and stood along the walls looking more relieved than any child in the room could understand. Permission slips had gone home the week before, and nearly every family signed without hesitation. The fear of the disease was so much greater than the fear of any needle that organized resistance barely existed anywhere in the country. Within a few years, the oral vaccine on a sugar cube replaced the injection, and children lined up again, this time opening their mouths instead of rolling up their sleeves. By the close of the decade, reported polio cases had dropped by well over 90%. The vaccination lines at school were among the largest coordinated public health efforts the country had ever seen, and every child who stood in one remembers the gymnasium floor, the sharp smell of rubbing alcohol, and the strange, quiet calm of an entire school waiting its turn. Number 39. The block party on the 4th of July. On the morning of the 4th, somebody dragged a folding table to the end of the driveway and the rest of the block followed. By noon, the street was closed to traffic, lined with card tables covered in red, white, and blue tablecloths, and crowded with every family within walking distance. The food came from every kitchen on the block: potato salad, deviled eggs, hot dogs on a charcoal grill, watermelon cut into slabs, pitchers of lemonade and iced tea. Nobody coordinated. Everyone just brought something. Children ran through lawn sprinklers and threw firecrackers in the gutter. Fathers stood around the grill arguing about charcoal versus lighter fluid. When it got dark, somebody set off bottle rockets in the street while mothers kept the little ones at a safe distance. The neighborhood smelled like gunpowder and grilled meat until midnight. It required no permits, no insurance, and no committee. Just a street, a set of neighbors who knew each other by name, and a shared belief that the 4th was everyone's holiday to throw. Number 38. Getting dressed up just to go. Downtown. You did not leave the house in what you slept in. Going downtown meant putting on proper clothes. For men, that meant a pressed shirt, slacks, a belt, and polished shoes. For women, it meant a dress, stockings, a hat, and gloves. For children, it meant being scrubbed, combed, and warned. Downtown was where the department stores were, the bank, the post office, the good restaurants. You dressed for it the way you dressed for church, because it was a public space where people you knew might see you, and being seen in anything less than your best reflected on the family. The custom applied even to shopping. Women did not browse the dress department in a house dress. Men did not walk into the hardware store in an undershirt. Casual clothing existed, but it stayed at home, in the yard, or at the lake. Downtown was formal territory, and looking the part was not optional. When suburban shopping centers and strip malls replaced downtown, the dress code went with it. Number 37. Taking a casserole to a neighbor who was sick or grieving. When someone on the block got sick, had a baby, or lost a family member, the first thing the women on the street did was cook. A casserole, a pot of soup, a plate of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, or a cake delivered on a plate that was never expected back in a hurry. The food arrived at the front door with a few quiet words and no expectation of a long visit. You left it, said you were sorry or congratulations, and went home. The next neighbor arrived an hour later with something else. Nobody organized it. There was no sign-up sheet. It simply happened, because that was what you did when something happened on your street. The gesture carried more weight than a card or a phone call because it was physical, warm, and useful. You could eat a casserole. You could not eat sympathy. When neighborhoods grew less connected, the automatic casserole delivery faded. Number 36. Playing with silly putty until the egg was lost. Forever. Silly putty came in a red plastic egg about the size of a large walnut, and inside was a smooth, flesh-colored lump of silicone that did not behave like anything else in the known universe. You could bounce it like a rubber ball. You could stretch it slowly into a long, thin rope. You could snap it in half with a sharp pull. You could press it flat against the Sunday comics and lift a perfect mirror image of Dick Tracy or Blondie off the newsprint. The material was invented by accident during the war when engineers at General Electric were trying to develop synthetic rubber for military use. What they got instead was a substance that bounced higher than rubber, stretched farther than taffy, shattered like glass if you hit it with a hammer, and picked up ink from any printed surface it touched. Nobody could find a practical application for it until a toy store owner named Ruth Fallgatter started selling it in 1950, packaged in those iconic plastic eggs. By 1955, Silly Putty was one of the best-selling toys in America. Every child who owned it went through the same progression. First the bouncing, then the stretching, then the comic strip transfer, which ruined the putty's color permanently and left a pinkish-gray smear across the newspaper. Then the inevitable moment when the putty was left on the carpet, the couch cushion, or inside a pants pocket that went through the washing machine. The egg itself disappeared within a week of purchase. It rolled under the couch, fell behind the dresser, or was repurposed as a tiny container for something else entirely. Without the egg, the putty collected lint, hair, and dust until it resembled a small gray tumor that stuck to everything and cleaned nothing. Mothers threw it away. Children mourned it briefly. And then Christmas or a birthday brought a fresh egg, and the whole cycle began again. Number 35. The public drinking fountain with the tall chrome arc. They stood on every downtown sidewalk, in every park, outside every public building, and inside every department store. A chrome or cast iron pedestal with a basin and a push button that sent a thin arc of cold water curving into the air just long enough to catch with your mouth. You leaned in, pressed the button, and drank. The water was cold, sometimes metallic, and it ran down your chin if you were not careful. Children stood on tiptoe to reach. Adults bent low and drank fast. Dogs lapped at the runoff that pooled around the base. In the South, some fountains had 2 basins, one marked for white patrons and one marked for colored, a humiliation built into public architecture that the civil rights movement eventually dismantled. By the end of the century, bottled water had replaced the public fountain as the default way to drink outside. Number 34. The sewing pattern from McCall's pinned to fabric on the dining room table. Most mothers in the 1950s made at least some of their family's clothes. The patterns came in paper, envelopes from the fabric store, printed on tissue-thin paper with dotted lines, notches, and arrows. You pinned the pattern pieces to the fabric, cut around them with heavy shears, and assembled the garment on a sewing machine. The dining room table became the cutting surface. It was the only flat area in the house big enough to lay out an entire dress. Pins covered the table. Fabric scraps fell on the floor. The sewing machine, usually a singer in a wooden cabinet, ran for hours in the evening. A skilled seamstress could produce a dress that looked store-bought for a fraction of the price. Easter dresses, school clothes, curtains, and slipcovers all came off the same machine. When ready-made clothing became cheap enough to undercut homemade, the pattern envelopes piled up in drawers, and the sewing machine fell silent. Number 33. The Saturday morning trip to the barber shop. Every boy and every father went. The shop had a red and white striped pole outside, a row of chrome and leather chairs inside, and a bench along the wall where you sat and waited your turn. The barber knew your name. He knew your haircut. He did not ask what you wanted unless you were new. The clippers buzzed. The scissors snipped. He lathered the back of your neck with a brush and shaved it clean with a straight razor. When it was done, he spun the chair toward the mirror, held up a hand mirror behind your head, and asked if that looked right. The shop smelled like talcum powder, barbicide, and aftershave. Men talked about baseball, weather, and nothing. Boys sat in the chair on a booster seat and tried not to flinch when the clippers hit the spot behind the ear. The whole visit cost $1 and lasted 20 minutes. It was a ritual, not a chore, and every man who grew up going on Saturday morning knows exactly what that shop smelled like. Number 32. Sock hops in the school gymnasium. After a Friday football game or on a Saturday evening, the gym floor was cleared, the bleachers were pushed back, and a record player or a small band was set up on the stage. Students danced in their socks to protect the varnished wood floor. You left your shoes by the door. The gymnasium smelled like floor wax and perspiration. The girls stood on one side, the boys stood on the other. Somebody crossed the floor first, and the rest followed. The music was rock and roll, doo-wop, or whatever the local radio station was playing that week. Chaperones stood along the walls. Teachers patrolled the corners. Couples danced close during slow songs and were separated by a teacher if they got too close. The whole event lasted 2 hours and cost $0.25 at the door. For many teenagers in the 1950s, the sock hop was the closest thing to a nightclub they would see before college, and the slow dance at the end of the night was the event they actually came for. Number 31. The malt shop where teenagers gathered after school. It was a small shop near the high school with a counter, a row of chrome stools, a soda fountain, and a jukebox in the corner. You ordered a chocolate malt, a cherry Coke, or a root beer float, dropped a nickel in the jukebox, and stayed until your parents expected you home. The malt itself was ice cream blended with malt powder and milk until it was thick enough to stand a straw in. The man behind the counter mixed it in a metal cup on a spindle mixer and poured it into a tall glass, leaving the overflow in the metal cup beside it. You got the glass and the extra, which felt like getting something for free. The malt shop was where plans were made, gossip was exchanged, and couples sat side by side on chrome stools sharing a single straw. When fast food chains moved in and teenagers got cars, the malt shop lost its monopoly. But through the entire 1950s, it was the place where being young and having nowhere to be was reason enough to sit. Number 30. The newsreel before the feature film at the movie theater. Before the movie started, the theater ran a short reel of filmed news. World events, sports highlights, natural disasters, presidential speeches, and human interest stories played on the big screen with a narrator's voice delivering every headline in the same urgent, clipped tone. For many families, the newsreel was the only moving picture news they saw all week. Television was still new, and not every home had one. The theater screen was larger, the image was sharper, and the experience of watching news with 300 strangers in the dark gave it a weight that a living room set could not match. The newsreels came from studios like Movietone and Path, and they ran about 10 minutes. By the late 1950s, television news had made them redundant. Theaters dropped them one by one, replacing them with previews and concession ads. The last one ran in the late 1960s. But for the generation that first saw Eisenhower's inauguration and the launch of Sputnik on a movie screen, the newsreel was how the world arrived. Number 29. The corrective shoes with the metal brace that children wore. If a pediatrician decided that a child's feet were flat, turned in, or growing crooked, the prescription was a pair of corrective shoes. They were stiff, brown, lace-up boots with a thick sole, and sometimes a metal bar connecting the two shoes at the bottom that the child wore at night to straighten the alignment. The shoes were ugly. They were heavy. They made running harder and playing worse. Children who wore them were self-conscious, and children who did not wore regular sneakers and were not. The night brace was the worst part. You lay in bed with your feet locked into position by a rigid metal bar, unable to roll over or bend your knees comfortably. By the 1970s, medical opinion shifted, and most pediatricians concluded that flat feet in children usually corrected themselves. The corrective shoe industry collapsed almost overnight, but the children who wore them through the 1950s remember the weight, the squeak of the leather, and the specific misery of being the only kid on the block who could not run in regular shoes. Number 28. Paper dolls cut from a book or the back of a cereal box. They came in small booklets at the 5 and dime, printed on heavy cardstock, with a figure on one page and a wardrobe of outfits on the next. You cut out the doll, then cut out the dresses, coats, hats, and shoes, each one with small white tabs that folded over the doll's shoulders and waist to hold the outfit in place. Girls sat on the bedroom floor arranging wardrobes for hours. Movie star paper dolls were the most popular. You could dress Elizabeth Taylor in a ball gown or Doris Day in a summer dress. The tabs bent and tore. The dresses fell off. The entire collection fit inside a shoebox. Some cereal boxes printed paper dolls on the back panel, and children cut them out at the breakfast table. The figures were flat, fragile, and worth nothing, but they kept a child busy on a rainy afternoon for the cost of a pair of scissors and a little floor space. Number 27. The telephone table in the hallway with the little seat. The phone had one location in the house, and it was usually the hallway. Beside it sat a small wooden table with a shelf for the phone book, a notepad and pencil, and a narrow chair or bench where you sat while you talked. Privacy did not exist. You sat in the hall where everyone could hear both sides of the conversation. Teenagers stretched the cord as far as it would reach, sometimes around a corner and into a closet. The cord on a busy household phone was permanently coiled, tangled, and stretched to twice its original length. The table itself was a specific piece of furniture sold in department stores as a telephone stand. Some had a hinged seat that folded up when not in use. Others had a small drawer for the address book when phones went cordless and then wireless. The table lost its reason to exist, but every teenager who sat on that bench twisting the cord around one finger remembers the whole family pretending not to listen. Number 26. The shoe shine stand outside the train station or the hotel. A wooden platform with a raised chair, a footrest, and a man with a box of polishes, brushes, and rags. You climbed up, put your feet on the brass rails, and the shoe shine man went to work. He snapped the rag against the leather with a rhythm that sounded rehearsed, He applied polish, buffed it, applied another coat, and buffed again until the shoe reflected light. The whole process took 5 minutes and cost a quarter. A dime tip was customary. Every train station, hotel lobby, and downtown office district had at least one stand. Businessmen stopped on the way to work. Soldiers stopped before reporting. Boys with portable shine boxes set up on street corners and worked for pocket money. When casual shoes replaced dress shoes in the workplace, and when leather uppers gave way to synthetic materials that did not polish, the shoe shine stand disappeared. The snap of that rag against a polished Oxford was a common city sound, and it is gone. Number 25. The Brownie Camera and the Family Snapshot. Kodak sold the Brownie for a few dollars, and it turned every family into its own photographer. The camera was a small box with a viewfinder on top, a single shutter button, and a roll of film inside that held 12 exposures. You held it at waist level, looked down through the viewfinder, and pressed the button. The shutter clicked and the film advanced. 12 pictures per roll. No preview, no delete. You found out what you had taken when the prints came back from the drugstore a week later. Every birthday, every holiday, every first day of school produced a snapshot. The prints were small, square, and sometimes blurry, with white borders and a date stamped on the back. They went into a shoebox or a photo album with black paper pages and adhesive corners. The camera was so simple that children operated it by age 8, and the photographs it produced are the only images that survive from most ordinary families in the 1950s. Number 24. The screen door that slammed 100 times a day. Every house had one. A wooden frame with wire mesh, hung on a spring that pulled it shut the instant you let go. The sound it made, a sharp wooden crack followed by a rattle of the frame, was the background percussion of every summer day. Children went in and out without stopping. The door slammed behind each trip, and from inside the house you could count the entries and exits by the bangs. Mothers yelled not to let the door slam, which changed nothing. The spring was too strong, the wood was too light. The door slammed, and that was that. The screen kept the flies out and the air moving. At night it let the breeze through while the house cooled down. In the morning the mesh was covered with moths, and June bugs pressed against the wire, drawn to the kitchen light. The screen door sound is one of the most universal memories of a 1950s childhood, and it has no modern equivalent. Storm doors and sealed windows killed it. Number 23. Building a scooter out of a board and a roller skate. You found a 2x4 in the garage, pried apart an old metal roller skate into its front and back halves, and nailed one half to each end of the board. Then you nailed a wooden crate upright to the front end for handlebars, and you had a vehicle. The wheels were steel and loud on concrete. The ride was rough, rattling your teeth on every sidewalk crack. Steering meant leaning, which barely worked, and stopping meant dragging a foot or bailing off entirely, which worked even less. The crate at the front sometimes had bottle caps hammered into it for decoration or a license plate number scratched into the wood with a nail. On most blocks, you could spot one kid who built a solid 1.5 dozen who could not. The solid ones rolled fast and straight. The rest wobbled, threw wheels at speed, or folded on the first downhill run. Either way, it cost nothing to build, required no store-bought parts beyond the sacrificed skate, and gave you wheels until the nails worked loose or the board cracked in half. Pure junkyard engineering, and it belonged to anyone who owned a hammer. Number 22. The icebox before electric refrigerators reached every home. In the early 1950s, some households, especially in rural areas and older city apartments, still kept food cold in a wooden cabinet insulated with zinc or tin and cooled by a block of ice. The ice sat in the top compartment. Food went below. Meltwater drained through a tube into a pan underneath that somebody had to empty every day, or the kitchen floor got a puddle. The iceman delivered fresh blocks on a schedule, carrying them up the steps with iron tongs and leaving a trail of water on the front walk. Children followed the ice truck in summer and begged for chips of ice to suck on. The Iceman shaved pieces off the block with a pick and handed them over without breaking stride. Electric refrigerators had been available since the 1930s, but not every family could afford one. By the late 1950s, the icebox was nearly extinct. The word survived, though. People who grew up with an icebox called the refrigerator the icebox for the rest of their lives. Number 21. The fish truck that came through the neighborhood on Fridays. In many neighborhoods, especially in Catholic areas where families ate fish every Friday, a truck with a refrigerated bed pulled through the streets once a week selling fresh fish. The driver honked or rang a bell, and women came out with plates or newspaper to carry the purchase home. The truck carried cod, perch, flounder, shrimp, and whatever the local catch provided. The fish sat on crushed ice in metal trays. You pointed at what you wanted. The man wrapped it in brown paper, and you paid in cash. The truck smelled exactly like you would expect. Children held their noses. Cats appeared from every direction. The transaction was fast, and the fish was on the dinner table by 6 o'clock. When supermarkets added fish counters and the Friday meat restriction loosened after the Second Vatican Council, the fish truck lost most of its reason to exist. But on a warm Friday afternoon in the 1950s, you could smell it coming from 3 houses away. Number 20. The Palmer Method handwriting drills. Every morning, before arithmetic, before reading, before anything else happened in the school day, every student opened a lined composition book and practiced the Palmer method of cursive penmanship. You placed your forearm flat on the desk, held the pencil between your first 2 fingers and thumb, and moved your whole arm, not just your fingers, across the page. The exercises started with ovals, rows of ovals, drawn in a continuous motion, filling line after line, then push-pulls, then capital letters, one at a time, repeated until the shape was consistent. The teacher walked the rows, checking posture, grip, and slant. Neatness counted for grades. A messy paper got marked down regardless of whether the answers were correct. Left-handed students struggled because the method assumed a right-handed writer, and some teachers forced the switch. The drills continued daily through elementary school, and by the time a child reached 5th grade, Palmer cursive was automatic. It was also, for many children, the most tedious part of the entire school day. Number 19. The backyard clothesline and Monday wash day. In the 1950s, Monday was laundry day. Not an option, not a preference, Monday. The entire neighborhood ran on the same schedule, and by mid-morning every clothesline on the block was full. The line ran between 2 metal T-shaped poles sunk in concrete at opposite ends of the yard, or between a pole and a hook on the side of the house. A canvas bag of wooden clothespins hung from a wire loop that slid along the line so you could reach each section without moving a basket. Sheets went up first, because they took the longest to dry and needed the most space. Then shirts, hung by the tails. Then socks in pairs. Then underwear, which some women hid behind the sheets so the neighbors would not see. Everything was sorted by type and hung with military precision. The clothes smelled like wind and grass and sunshine when they came down, a smell that no dryer sheet has ever reproduced. In winter, the clothes froze stiff on the line and came inside like cardboard cutouts that thawed on a rack near the radiator. The ritual took half the day: washing, wringing, carrying, hanging, waiting, collecting, folding. When automatic dryers became affordable in the late 1950s and 1960s, the clothesline went slack. Some towns eventually banned them as eyesores, but the women who spent every Monday morning pinning sheets to a wire in the backyard remember it as work that had a rhythm, a result, and a smell that machines never matched. Number 18. The spelling bee as the biggest competition of the school year. It started in the classroom, moved to the auditorium, and sometimes reached the county or the state. Children stood in a line, received a word, and spelled it aloud letter by letter. One mistake and you sat down. Preparation meant studying word, lists printed on mimeographed sheets that went home every Friday. Parents drilled their children at the dinner table. Siblings quizzed each other on the bus. The words got harder as the competition advanced, moving from calendar and separate to words no 10-year-old had ever used in a sentence. The winner received a ribbon, a dictionary, or a small trophy. The whole school watched. Teachers stood in the wings. For children who could not throw a ball or run a fast lap, the spelling bee was the one public competition where being quiet and studious was an advantage. It still exists in some form, but in the 1950s it was the academic event of the year, and the child who won it was known by name. Number 17. Catching lightning bugs in a mason jar on summer nights. As the sky darkened, the yard began to blink. Small green flashes appeared low over the grass, drifting between the hedges and the garden fence, pulsing on and off in no particular pattern. You grabbed a jar from the kitchen, poked holes in the metal lid with a nail, and ran outside. The technique was simple. You watched for the flash, cupped your hands around the bug mid-flight, and dropped it into the jar. After 20 minutes, you had a dozen, and the jar glowed with a soft, uneven green light. Some children put the jar on their nightstand and fell asleep watching it pulse. By morning, the light was gone. The bugs were still. The jar went back to the kitchen. Nobody called them fireflies. They were lightning bugs, and catching them on a warm evening was one of those small seasonal events that marked the difference between a school night and a summer night. Where they still appear, children still catch them, but fewer yards have them now, and fewer children go outside after dark to look. Number 16. Milk delivered to the classroom in small glass bottles every morning. At 10 o'clock the crate arrived, carried by a student helper or left outside the classroom door by the custodian. Inside were small glass bottles of milk, one for each child, sealed with a cardboard cap that you pushed in with your thumb. The milk was whole. It was cold in the morning and warm by afternoon if the crate sat too long. You drank it through a paper straw that collapsed halfway through the bottle. Some children hated it. Some traded theirs. Some saved the cap and flicked it across the desk. The program was federally supported, part of the push to make sure every child got calcium regardless of what their family could afford. By the late 1960s, the glass bottles were replaced with waxed cartons, and the ritual lost its last piece of charm. But the memory of poking a straw through that cardboard cap and tasting cold whole milk in a warm classroom at 10 in the morning belongs to every child who went to school in the 1950s. Number 15. The percolator on the stove every morning. Before drip machines and single-serve pods, coffee was made in a percolator. It was a tall aluminum or stainless steel pot with a glass knob on the lid, and inside was a metal basket on a stem where you measured the grounds. You filled it with water, set it on the burner, and waited. When the water got hot enough, it rose through the stem, hit the grounds, and dripped back down. Then it did it again. And again. The glass knob on top let you watch the coffee darken from clear water to amber to deep brown. The sound was unmistakable, a rhythmic bubbling that meant the kitchen was open for business. Everybody had a theory about how long to let it perk. 4 minutes, 7 minutes, until it stops jumping. The coffee was strong, sometimes bitter, always hot, and it filled the entire house with a smell that is still the first thing some people associate with their mother's kitchen. When automatic drip machines took over in the 1970s, the percolator moved to the back of the cabinet and stayed there. Number 14. The vacant lot as the neighborhood playground. Every neighborhood had one. An empty lot between two houses, or at the end of the block, where the weeds grew knee-high and the ground was packed dirt from the feet of every child within walking distance. The lot belonged to nobody and everybody. It was the football field, the baseball diamond, the battleground, the fort, and the general assembly hall for every kid on the street. Bases were marked with old shirts or flat rocks. Boundaries were negotiated loudly and changed daily. The rules depended on how many players showed up, and they were argued about more than followed. In summer, the lot was occupied from morning until the streetlights came on. In winter, it turned into a no-man's land for snowball fights and sled runs if the slope was right. There was no equipment, no supervision, no maintenance. The occasional broken bottle or rusty nail was a hazard that children simply learned to watch for. When the lot was finally sold and a house went up on it, the kids moved to another lot further down the street or gave up and played in somebody's yard. But the lot had something a yard never did, which was the feeling of public land that answered to no parent. It was the closest thing to wilderness that a suburban child in the 1950s would ever know, and it was right there at the end of the block. Number 13. The crystal radio set a kid built from a kit. The kit came in a flat box from the hobby shop or the back pages of a magazine ad. Inside was a coil of copper wire, a germanium diode, an earphone, a small wooden board, and an instruction sheet. You wound the wire around a cardboard tube, connected the diode to the coil, ran a long antenna wire out the bedroom window, and attached it to a tree or a fence post, then clipped the ground wire to the nearest cold water pipe. You put the earphone to your ear, slid the tuning contact along the coil, and listened. What you heard was faint, scratchy, and miraculous. An AM radio station, sometimes two, coming through a device you built yourself with no battery and no plug. The signal ran on nothing but the radio waves passing through the antenna. For a child in the 1950s, this was as close to real science as you could get in your own bedroom, and the moment the first station came through that earphone was unforgettable. Number 12. The penny arcade at the boardwalk, or the amusement park. A dark room full of coin-operated machines, each one offering a different spectacle for a penny or a nickel. Mechanical fortune tellers, strength testers, crane games with prizes you could never grab, flip card viewers that showed a short moving picture when you turned the crank. The machines were mostly mechanical, driven by gears, springs, and levers. Some played a tune, some lit up. The mutoscope let you watch a 1-minute movie by turning a handle, and the subjects ranged from comedy skits to boxing matches. You entered with a pocket full of pennies and left with nothing but a paper fortune, a pressed penny, or the memory of the mechanical gypsy behind the glass who told you that great things were coming. The arcade was loud, dim, and it was one of the best places a child could spend half an hour for a dime. Number 11. The Victory Garden tradition that carried over from the war. During the war, families grew vegetables in their yards to supplement rationed food and free up supplies for the military. By the time the 1950s arrived, rationing was over, but the habit stayed. Thousands of families kept planting, not out of necessity, but out of routine and preference. The garden was already dug. The tools were already in the shed. The soil had been enriched over years of turning and composting. Walking away from a producing garden felt like waste to a generation raised on conservation. The Victory Garden name faded, but the practice continued as the backyard garden. It merged with suburban life, fitting between the swing set and the garage. For families who had rationed sugar, butter, and meat during the war, growing a row of tomatoes and a patch of green beans in peacetime was not nostalgia. It was insurance. They had seen what shortage looked like. Number 10. Writing a formal thank you note within a week of receiving any gift. The rule was absolute. You received a birthday present, a Christmas gift, a graduation card with money inside, and within 7 days you sat down with a pen and a piece of stationery and wrote a note. Not a phone call, not a wave across the yard. A written note, mailed with a stamp. Children were drilled on the format. Address the giver by name, mention the specific gift, say how you plan to use it, and close with warmth. Dear Aunt Helen, thank you for the sweater. It was worn to school on Monday and the compliments were many. With love, David. Mothers supervised. They checked spelling. They made you rewrite a sloppy draft. A child who failed to send a thank you note was discussed among the adults at the next family gathering, and the shame landed on the mother. The custom faded as telephones and then email made written correspondence feel outdated. Number 9. The soda fountain with cherry phosphates and lemon cokes. It stood behind the counter at the drugstore or the corner candy shop, a row of chrome taps, syrup dispensers, and a carbonation nozzle that the soda jerk operated with the confidence of a short-order cook. You sat on a round chrome stool that spun. You ordered a cherry phosphate, a vanilla Coke, a lemon Coke, an egg cream, or a chocolate soda, and the man behind the counter mixed it from scratch in a tall glass. The phosphate was tart and sweet, fizzy and sharp. The egg cream had no egg in it, just milk, chocolate syrup, and seltzer, stirred fast until it foamed. The glass was cold. The counter was clean. The whole production took a minute. Pre-mixed bottled soda replaced the fountain drink by the 1970s. The spinning stools went to antique shops. The syrup dispensers went to collectors. But the soda fountain was the center of the drugstore experience, and the taste of a hand-mixed cherry phosphate is something that a can has never duplicated. Number 8. The cloak of cigarette smoke that hung over every public space. In the 1950s, people smoked everywhere. In offices, in restaurants, in movie theaters, in hospitals, in elevators, on airplanes, in grocery stores, and in the waiting room at the pediatrician's office. The smoke was constant. It rose from desks, from dinner tables, from the hands of teachers in the teacher's lounge. Guests lit up in your living room without asking. Patients smoked in hospital beds. Doctors smoked while examining patients. Nobody cleared the air because there was nothing to clear it with. Windows stayed closed in winter. Ventilation was minimal. The yellow film on the ceiling above the kitchen table was nicotine. The smell in the upholstery was nicotine. The stain on the curtains was nicotine. Indoor smoking bans did not begin in earnest until the 1990s. For 4 decades, the air in every public building in America carried a permanent haze. The generation that grew up in it did not notice. Number 7. The good humor truck that rolled through the neighborhood every summer afternoon. You heard the bells before you saw it, a tinkling melody that cut through the sound of lawnmowers and sprinklers and screen doors slamming. Every child on the block dropped whatever they were doing and ran for the curb. The truck was white with blue lettering, and the driver wore a white uniform and a bow tie and made change from a silver coin belt strapped around his waist. The bars came out of a freezer in the back, each one wrapped in paper, and the choices never changed. Toasted almond, chocolate eclair, strawberry shortcake, coconut. The prices were printed on the side of the truck in numbers that meant something to a child with a quarter in a sweaty fist. The driver knew the route, knew the kids, and came at roughly the same time every day, so reliable that mothers used him as a clock. When the trucks gave way to convenience store freezer cases and prepackaged novelties, the bells stopped and summer afternoons got a little quieter. Number 6. The TV sign-off at midnight and the national anthem. Television did not run all night. At the end of the broadcast day, usually between 11 and midnight, the station played a recording of the Star-Spangled Banner over footage of a waving flag. Then the screen went to a test pattern, then to static. If you fell asleep in front of the set, you woke up to a high-pitched tone and a circular pattern of lines and numbers filling the screen. The static hissed. The room glowed gray. Somebody got up and turned the set off. The sign-off was a nightly boundary. It said, "The day is over. There is nothing left to watch. Go to bed." There were no infomercials. No late-night reruns, no streaming. The networks simply stopped. In a world where the screen never goes dark, it is hard to imagine one that did so every single night on purpose. But for the families who heard that anthem and watched the flag fade to static, it was as routine as locking the front door. Number 5. 3 channels on the television and nothing else. In most of the country, the television received 3 networks and possibly a local station that signed on late and signed off early. That was the entire selection. You turned the dial, which clicked through 13 positions, and on 3 of them a picture appeared. The rest was snow. This meant the entire country watched the same programs at the same time. Monday night, Wednesday night, Saturday night, everyone on your block saw the same show and talked about it the next morning. A popular program drew an audience that no modern broadcast can approach because there was nowhere else to go. Arguments over what to watch were domestic events. The father controlled the dial. The children lobbied. The mother mediated. If the family had one television, which most did, whoever lost the argument left the room. The concept of watching whatever you want whenever you want would not have made sense to anyone alive in 1955. Number 4. The cigarette lighter built into the car dashboard. Every car in the 1950s came with one, a small chrome cylinder set into the dashboard, connected to the electrical system. You pushed it in, waited for the heating coil to glow orange, pulled it out, and pressed the glowing end to the tip of a cigarette. Nobody thought twice about it. The lighter was standard equipment, as expected as the steering wheel. Ashtrays were built into the doors. Some had ashtrays in the rear armrest for backseat passengers. The car was a smoking lounge on wheels. Children played with the lighter when nobody was looking. The orange glow was fascinating and the burn was inevitable. By the 1990s, car makers started removing the lighter and replacing the socket with a power outlet. The ashtrays disappeared a few years later. A car from the 1950s, fully equipped for smoking by every occupant including the children, now looks like an artifact from a civilization that operated by a completely different set of rules. Number 3. The hand signal out the car window instead of a turn signal. Older cars in the 1950s did not always have electric turn signals, and even cars that did often relied on hand signals as the standard way to communicate with other drivers. Left turn, arm straight out the window. Right turn, arm out, bent upward at the elbow. Stopping, arm out, bent downward. Every driver learned these in driving school, and children learned them by watching from the back seat. In rain, in snow, in traffic, you stuck your arm out the window and hoped the driver behind you was paying attention. Passengers in the front seat got a face full of wind. Drivers with bad shoulders did it anyway. Turn signals became mandatory on all new cars by the late 1950s, and hand signals moved from everyday practice to emergency backup. But the generation that drove before the switch remembers cold air on an outstretched arm and the trust it required. Number 2. The push-button automatic transmission on the car dashboard. For a few years in the late 1950s, Chrysler, Plymouth, DeSoto, and Dodge replaced the shift lever with a row of push buttons mounted on the dashboard to the left of the steering wheel. You pressed a button labeled D to drive, R to reverse, and N for neutral. The system was simple and modern-looking. It freed up space on the steering column and the floor. Advertisements called it the transmission of the future. Children found the buttons irresistible and pressed them at every opportunity, which was a problem when the engine was running. The push-button transmission lasted about 5 model years before it was replaced by the column-mounted lever that became the industry standard. Reliability issues and public preference for a physical shifter killed it. But if your family drove a Chrysler in 1958, you remember pushing a small chrome button on the dash to put the car in gear and wondering why every other car still needed a lever. Number 1. The bench seat in the front of every automobile. The front seat of a 1950s car was a single continuous bench that stretched from door to door, upholstered in vinyl or cloth, wide enough for 3 adults. There was no center console, no armrest divider, no individual bucket seats, just one long seat. A mother sat in the middle with a child on her lap and a father behind the wheel. Nobody wore a seatbelt because there were none. The bench seat was the reason a couple could sit side by side on a Saturday night drive, and it was the reason a family of 5 could ride in a car with only 2 rows. When bucket seats arrived in the 1960s, the bench seat moved to the back and then disappeared entirely. The console that replaced the open space between driver and passenger added storage and cup holders, but it also put a wall between 2 people. In a 1950s sedan, there was nothing between the driver and the passenger but 6 inches of upholstery, and that was exactly as close as most families wanted to be. 100 memories. Not one of them made the front page. Not one of them won a prize or earned a place in a museum. They were just the ordinary things that filled ordinary days in a decade that moved slower than anything we know now. The shoe store with the X-ray machine, the milk truck before dawn, the screen door that slammed behind every child who ran outside, the smoke in every room, the hat on every head, the clothesline on every Monday. All of it lived in the background, too common to photograph and too familiar to describe, until it disappeared. If something on this list brought back a sound, a smell, the weight of a glass bottle in your hand, or the taste of cod liver oil before breakfast, drop it in the comments. Tell us which one you forgot. And if you stayed for all 100, hit subscribe and stick around, because there is more where this came from.